The palace had been quiet in a way that felt wrong. Not the usual quiet of early mornings when the staff moved like ghosts through marble corridors, sliding trays onto sideboards and pulling curtains back with practiced silence. This was the other kind. The kind that settles into walls. The kind you feel in your chest before you know why. William had not slept. He'd tried stretched out on the narrow sofa in the family waiting room at the London clinic, one arm thrown over his eyes, the other hand pressed flat against his sternum like he was checking for a heartbeat. Around 2 in the morning a nurse had appeared with a blanket and he'd accepted it without speaking, which wasn't like him. Protocol said something about being gracious, present, accessible. Every instinct he'd ever trained into himself said keep the face together. Show the calm. Be the structure. He'd done it for years. He was very good at it. But the blanket had smelled like hospital laundry, that particular bleached clean sterility, and something behind his eyes had gone dangerously warm for a moment, and he'd had to look at the ceiling and count the tiles until it passed. 42 tiles. He'd counted them 3 times. The children were at home. That had been the decision and it had been the right one, he knew that, because Charlotte would have asked too many questions and Louis would have absorbed the tension like a sponge and George was 13 now and understood more than anyone wanted him to, and the understanding showed in the set of his jaw in a way that looked too much like his father and not enough like a boy who should still be worried about football fixtures. They were being looked after. The people he trusted most. Everything was handled. Everything except this. He'd stood outside the surgical suite door for 11 seconds before they told him he couldn't go in. He'd counted those too, apparently. He was counting everything now. Inside that room, Catherine was having surgery that should have been routine. Abdominal. Planned. Every consultant had used words like straightforward and were confident and excellent prognosis, and he'd nodded at each one because his training had also taught him to receive information without showing how it lands. But, afterward, alone in the car on the way to the clinic, he'd pressed his thumb hard into the center of his palm, a thing he had always done, though he'd never told anyone, and held it there until the urge to put his fist through the window passed. He was not afraid. He told himself that. Several times. Emphatically. The clock on the waiting room wall said 11:47 a.m. She'd gone in at 7:15. That was 4 hours and 32 minutes. Not that he was counting. There is a kind of love that announces itself constantly, and then there is the other kind, the load-bearing kind, the kind that holds the whole structure up without anyone seeing the work. William had understood this distinction for years. He'd watched it in others. Seen its presence and its absence and what the absence cost. He had been determined, in the private and unspectacular way of determined men, to build something that did not collapse under pressure. He had not anticipated that the pressure would be Catherine in a surgical gown, walking calmly down a corridor with her chin up, turning once to look back at him over her shoulder. She'd smiled. That was the thing he kept returning to. She'd smiled the specific smile she wore when she knew he was unraveling and wanted him to know she could see it and that she found him, in that moment, almost endearing. Not the public smile, not the composed, luminous, warm but measured expression that had graced 10,000 photographs. The other one. The private one with the slight raise on the left side, the one that only lived in rooms with no cameras. She'd given him that smile and turned the corner and disappeared. He'd stood there for 11 seconds. At some point after noon, a member of the medical team came out to say everything was progressing normally, no complications, they were pleased with how it was going. William had thanked him with the kind of precise courtesy that required no emotional expenditure and then sat back down and stared at the floor. His phone had 73 messages. He'd read 2 of them. One from Harry, which he wasn't ready for. One from his father, which was brief and said the right things and somehow still felt like an echo arriving from a very long distance. He put the phone face down on the cushion beside him. Outside, London was doing what London always does, moving with complete indifference to the private catastrophes occurring inside its buildings. Buses. Pigeons. Someone honking. A delivery driver shouting at a cyclist with cheerful British rage. The ordinary percussion of a city that does not pause. He'd always found that either comforting or unbearable, depending on the day. Today he couldn't decide. She came out of surgery at 2:41 p.m. The consultant said successful. Said very well. Said she'd be groggy for a bit, but everything had gone exactly as they'd hoped and he should feel reassured. William shook the man's hand. "Thank you," he said. 2 words. Level voice. Eye contact held for the appropriate duration. A nod. The consultant left. A nurse turned back to something at a workstation. The corridor was momentarily empty. William stood with his hands at his sides and looked at the middle distance for a long moment. Then, he sat down on the floor. Not a collapse. Not a dramatic gesture. Just, he sat down, back against the wall, knees up, face tipped back, and breathed. Long and slow. The way he'd been taught after too many funerals and too many cameras and too many moments where the correct response was to stand perfectly upright and give nothing away. Nobody was watching. He breathed. Not fully, somewhere in the amber gauze between sedation and consciousness, her eyelids moving, her hands making small adjustments against the blanket like she was trying to find something. William was in the chair beside her. He'd been in the chair since 3:20. He'd had 3 cups of tea he didn't taste and a sandwich someone had brought that was still wrapped in cling film on the windowsill. Catherine said. He leaned forward. Hey. Her eyes opened. Focused. Found him. Hey, she said, in a voice like gravel and wool. You're done, he said. It went well. You're completely done. She looked at the ceiling for a moment. Processing. He watched her absorb the information, that particular thing she did where she went quiet and still and assembled the pieces, like she was reading a document before responding to it. Even sedated. Even coming out of the worst hours she'd had in years. Still himself, still methodical. God, he loved her in a way that was sort of structurally embarrassing. The children, she said. Fine. They're wonderful. I spoke to them an hour ago. Charlotte made Louis eat something green, apparently under protest. The left side of Catherine's mouth moved. There it was. Good girl, she murmured. Rest. I'm resting. You're talking. Barely. He reached over and covered her hand with his. She turned her palm up, a slow, deliberate movement, and threaded her fingers through his without opening her eyes again. The room was dim. The machines made their steady sounds. Outside the window, London had gone into its evening register, the light going amber and, low over the rooftops, the specific gold of late afternoon in England that Catherine had once described as the light that makes everything look like it's already a memory. He'd thought that was the most accurate thing he'd ever heard. He sat in it now and didn't let go of her hand. Later, much later, when she'd slept properly and eaten something and the color had come back into her face in the way that made him feel like he could set down something very heavy he'd been carrying, she looked at him across the hospital tray with the particular expression that meant she was about to say something honest. He braced himself, which she noticed, which made her expression shift to the one that meant she found him hopeless in an affectionate way. You sat on the floor, she said. He said nothing. The nurse told me. After they told you it had gone well. She said the prince sat down on the floor in the corridor. I was tired. William. I was sitting on the floor in a normal, tired way. There is no normal tired way to sit on a floor at your age. I'm not sure what age has to do with it. You sat on the floor, she said again, and her voice had gone soft in the way it did when she wasn't teasing anymore. Because you were scared. He looked at the window. You're allowed to say it, she said. He looked back at her. Her face was pale and the shadows under her eyes were real and her hair was loose in the way it only ever was in private, and she was looking at him with the steady attention she always gave him, the full attention, the kind that made people feel seen through, which was uncomfortable when you were used to managing what people saw. I counted the tiles, he said. In the ceiling. Of the waiting room. 42. 3 times. She didn't say anything. And I counted how long I stood outside the theater door before they told me I had to move. 11 seconds. He exhaled. I don't know why. I needed something to count. I know, she said. You can't, how do you know? Because, she said, you've been counting things since the day I met you. It's how you carry things you can't put down. You've always done it. You probably don't even realize. He stared at her. You counted the steps between the altar and the door on our wedding day, she said. You told me. After. You said there were 38. You'd counted them walking in. He had no memory of telling her that. 22 years, he said, after a pause. Next month, she said. I'm still not used to you. She smiled, the real one, the private one, the left side. Good. The statement went out the following morning. It was a single paragraph. Careful language. Respectful of privacy. Confirmation that the Princess of Wales had undergone successful abdominal surgery, that she was recovering well, that she and the Prince of Wales were grateful for the exceptional care of the medical team, and that the family requested privacy during this period of recovery. William had written the first draft himself at 6 in the morning, sitting at the small desk in the family waiting room with a cold cup of tea and the particular fierce concentration of a man who has spent a lifetime learning how to say true things in language that reveals only what it chooses to. He'd written it 3 times before he was satisfied. Not because the words were difficult. Because the words were insufficient. There was no clause in institutional language for, my wife walked down that corridor and turned and gave me the smile that belongs only to me, and I stood there for 11 seconds not breathing. There was no sentence structure for, I sat on a hospital floor and felt my whole body unclench for the first time since January. So he wrote the paragraph. Clean and composed and correct. And he kept the rest. 3 days later, Catherine was home. Not the palace, the house. The real one. The one where the kitchen table had a scratch from when Louis had decided in 2021 that forks were also apparently for carving, and the back garden had the specific overgrown corner that none of them had ever gotten around to doing anything with, and the dog had a bed that he never slept in because he preferred the bottom of the stairs, and the whole thing smelled like the accumulated ordinary life of 5 people who actually lived there. Catherine moved carefully. She would not be moved carefully by others, which William had anticipated and accepted and was only moderately losing his mind over. She sat in the kitchen that first evening and drank tea and put her feet up on the chair he pulled over without being asked, and there was a peacefulness to it that felt almost unbearable in the best possible way. The children had been extraordinary. George had made pasta. Slightly overcooked, aggressively salted, served with a sauce from a jar that he'd heated and then transferred into a real saucepan before presenting it because he'd decided the jar was undignified, which was so spectacularly his mother's child that Catherine had looked at William over George's head with an expression of pure helpless love. Charlotte had brought flowers from the garden, slightly haphazard, slightly wilting, wrapped in actual twine because she'd been watching something on the internet apparently. She'd presented them with the combination of great dignity and great uncertainty that was entirely Charlotte, and then fled to the other side of the room before anyone could make it a moment. Louis had climbed immediately and carefully into Catherine's lap. Louis, Mummy can't, he's fine, Catherine said. Her arms went around him. He's fine. Louis stayed there for 40 minutes, watching television, saying nothing about it at all, which was the single most uncharacteristic thing William had ever witnessed from his youngest child and, therefore, the most accurate measure of how the last several days had landed in that small fierce body. That night William found George sitting on the top stair in the dark. Not doing anything. Just sitting. Knees pulled up, chin resting on them, looking at nothing. The posture of someone with something heavy in them that doesn't have a shape yet. William sat down beside him. They were quiet for a while. Below, he could hear Catherine's voice in the kitchen, low, comfortable, the sound of her talking to the dog the way she did when she thought no one could hear, asking him serious questions and waiting politely for responses. She sounds normal, George said. She is normal. She sounds like herself. She is herself.
A beat. She was always going to be. George's jaw moved. That jaw.
That terrible, familiar jaw that William saw in mirrors and, now apparently in his son, carrying exactly the same things in exactly the same way.
I wasn't sure, George said. Just that. Flat. Honest. William looked at the darkness of the hallway below them. He thought about 42 ceiling tiles. 11 seconds. A floor in a hospital corridor.
The weight of things you carry in your hands that you can't put down, counting them instead just to feel them.
Neither was I, he said.
George looked at him. This was clearly not the expected answer. The expected answer was reassuring and calibrated and contained. The expected answer was the one that made a 13-year-old feel that the adults had it managed, that the structure held, that the world continued to be a place where fathers knew things.
William held his son's gaze.
I was scared, he said.
Properly. Not a little bit.
I sat on a hospital floor, mate. George stared at him.
You sat on the floor?
The corridor, yes. When they told me she was out.
I just sat down. That's mad. It was a bit mad, yes.
Something shifted in George's face. Something loosened that had been held very tightly for, William suspected, quite a few days. I didn't sleep, George said.
The first night. No.
I kept thinking, he stopped.
You don't have to say it. I know. I just a breath. She said she'd be fine. She kept saying it. She wasn't scared.
She was scared, William said.
She's brilliant at not showing it. She's had a lot of practice. But she was.
George was quiet for a long moment. She told me to take care of Charlotte and Louis, he said.
Before she went in. She took my hands and said, look after them while I'm gone. William felt something move through him that he didn't name. And, he said. I did. The jaw again. The set of it. Louis ate dinner every night. I made sure. I know. Charlotte cried once. The second night.
I didn't tell her I heard, but I went and knocked and said I was making hot chocolate and was she coming and she said yes and she came down and we didn't talk about it.
That was exactly right, William said.
Is it weird that I'm still? George paused.
She's fine. She's downstairs. I know she's fine.
But I still feel like no, William said.
It's not weird.
It takes time for the body to believe what the brain knows. You were afraid for several days.
That doesn't just end because the reason ended.
George absorbed this.
Does it ever? He asked. Older question than 13. Much older.
William thought of a woman walking down a corridor, turning, giving him the smile that belonged only to him.
You find things to do with it, he said. You count ceiling tiles. You make your brother eat his dinner. You knock on your sister's door.
You sit on the top stair at night and you wait until it gets quieter inside.
Does it get quieter?
Below them, Catherine's voice murmured to the dog. Something about his supper and whether he had opinions on chicken versus lamb. The dog appeared to have opinions. George made a sound, not quite a laugh.
Something adjacent. Yeah, William said. It gets quieter.
They sat together for a while longer, father and son, on the top stair in the dark.
Not saying much. Not needing to.
The particular quiet of people who have been carrying the same thing and are now, for a moment, setting it down in the same place.
Below them, ordinary sounds. A dog.
A woman who had walked down a corridor and come back. William pressed his thumb into the center of his palm, held it for 3 seconds. Then, he let go.